All right, thank you for tuning in. I'm Kyle Smith with Hagerty, and today we're doing a live stream for you guys. I appreciate you all tuning in to this member live stream. This is one of our wonderful Hagerty Drivers Club benefits. So we do these on a regular basis. We have a DIY one for you guys today. We have a ton of fun topics that we all talk through, but this is one of my favorites. I'm really happy to be here, that you guys tuned in to watch this. We're going to talk through it. We've got a 1971 Bronco here behind me, and we're going to be talking through a brake fluid flush. And it's something that's really important and should not be ignored on any vehicle. This stands for classic as well as modern and all the way through time. Now, of course, there will be a couple people out there online that will, of course, mention that, not every vehicle has brake fluid, and that is true. I myself have a 1930 Ford Model A that is still running rod brakes, and that's just life. However, the vast majority of collector and modern vehicles are using fluid or juice brakes. And so keeping the fluid fresh in those is a safety concern for a lot of folks. We want to make sure that you guys out there are able to enjoy your vehicle as much as possible. So for this one, we're going to talk through a couple of the key points to do with a brake fluid flush. So what fluid you should be using, how to actually go about the process, and a couple of the specialty tools that you might be tempted to purchase to make the job a little bit easier, and why some of those might be a good decision versus a bad decision. So stay tuned. We've got about a half hour to go through. And of course, at any point throughout this, please chime in. There is a comment section. Leave a question. There will be a question and answer towards the end. And also, Matt, who was running the live stream for me, he can throw those up on the screen. So if it's something you have a question while I'm doing it, there's the chance that I might be able to catch it then. If not, we'll address it at the end. That's no problem. So chime in if you can. But the nice part about doing brakes, as we talk through it on this particular vehicle, this is a very simple system, and all brake systems are very simple. It all has to do with hydraulic pressure. And so we want to make sure that the fluid in there can maintain that pressure properly. And that means making sure there's no water in the system. Brake fluid is hygroscopic. I believe I said that word correctly, but what that means is it attracts moisture. And so if you bring that moisture into the system, if you bring moisture into your brake fluid system on the vehicle, what's going to happen is that water has a significantly lower boiling point, think around 212 degrees Fahrenheit, rather than brake fluid, which will boil at close to 300 degrees for DOT 3, all the way up to 500 degrees for DOT 5 fluid. And we'll talk through the differences as to why you might adjust or change fluid in just a little bit. But brake fluid is something that's fairly inexpensive. You can buy a large bottle like this that's going to do an entire system flush on your vehicle. Something like this is going to be less than $20 in an afternoon, and you're going to be back on the road driving safely. So if we're talking about fluids, there's a couple that you're going to discuss. The most popular and kind of the go-to for most systems is DOT 3 fluid. And that DOT or that DOT measurement is just simply a standard for rating fluids. So DOT 3 means it adheres to a certain guideline to be rated at that. DOT 3 fluid is typically mixable between brands, but you will want to check and make sure on the back of a bottle. If you go to purchase one, if you have a favorite brand that you like to use, I use Lucas Synthetic. It's one that's easy access for me. Thurlby Auto Parts here in town, my friendly local parts shop, happens to have it on the shelf all the time, anytime I need it, and I go in and get a fresh container. It's no problem. From there, you go from DOT 3 up to DOT 4. And this is something that is going to raise the boiling point. Essentially, each time you're moving up through those ratings, it's going to raise the boiling point of the fluid. Now, DOT 3 at 300 degrees, I believe, is the exact rating on that one, right around 300 degrees boiling point. Might sound a little bit low, especially when you say that DOT 4 is 440-ish degrees, and DOT 5 comes in over 500. However, DOT 3 is the go-to for a standard street car. It's not any concern. The only time you're going to want to go up to a higher boiling temperature is if you're in a performance application or going to the track, a road course of some type or a drag race where you're building a lot of heat in the brakes very quickly, or it's holding that temperature for an extended period of time, you might need to upgrade. So .4 is going to have a little bit higher boiling point. It's not significantly more expensive than .3, and then you can step all the way up to .5. Now, this one is actually what we run in this Bronco here over at the Hagerty garage. This is one of the Hagerty collection vehicles, and there's a couple reasons to consider upgrading to this, both pros and cons. DOT brake fluid is incredibly corrosive and can take paint off of panels very easily. However, if you can get a synthetic .5 fluid, it will actually not strip paint. So it's something that if you might have a leak or if you're working on a system and you're nervous about damaging a vehicle, you can upgrade to a DOT5 fluid, and that will help ease your mind a little bit as you're working on that vehicle. Like I said, it has a boiling point over 500 degrees, so any high performance applications is what you're going to want to go with. And of course, all of this sounds so great, and so I know in your mind you're looking at me and saying, you know, Kyle, I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy some of that, but there's two drawbacks to this one. And the first is it's almost twice the price of a standard .3 or .4 fluid. So you're paying a little bit more. It's still a minimal investment. A small bottle like this is only $7, $8 at our local parts store. So you can buy a larger bottle of it. It's still not going to break the bank, especially considering the added protection and the ease of use. And then also, typically this does not play nice with your other fluids. So if you are switching out to .5, you need to completely flush the system and have only .5 fluid in your system, especially if you're going to a synthetic. This one happens to be a non-silicon or non-synthetic .5 fluid. So this will mix with other .5 fluids. However, you want to make sure that that is the only thing you're running in your system. So once you've selected the actual fluid that you're going to use for your application, whether that's going to be .3, which is pretty standard, or .5 if you're upgrading or changing things out. And of course, if you're curious on it, do a little bit of research. I recommend consulting with your owner's manual for the vehicle or other resources to make sure you're getting the correct thing. Typically, most classic vehicles are going to be running a standard .3. Modern high performance applications are going to be running .4 or .5, some type of synthetic fluid. So just keep an eye on it. Make sure you're buying the correct thing for your vehicle. And the last point when it comes to selecting fluid, this container here happens to have been sitting on my shelf for probably 3 or 4 months now, and this is not something to use. Like I mentioned earlier, brake fluid is something that attracts moisture, and so even though this is sealed fairly tightly with a threaded cap, this has attracted moisture out of the air that's in this bottle, and so I do not want to put this into a system and act like it's new fluid. Anytime you need it, brake fluid's cheap enough to go out and go ahead and purchase new fluid every time you're going to do something to your brakes. That's the nice thing in having multiple sizes of containers that you can purchase. If I only need a little bit, if I'm only changing one wheel cylinder or something like that, I can get just a little bit, go through one line. If I'm flushing out an entire system, I can buy a larger container and go through it as well. As far as disposing of brake fluid, do not mix it in with your oil. Most recycling centers won't accept that if it's been mixed in. It's actually a standard solvent, so what you can do is have a tray, just a standard turkey roaster pan, maybe your leftover one from Thanksgiving, fill it full of kitty litter, pour the brake fluid in there and allow it to evaporate, and it will go away. And then you can throw that kitty litter out and you have no problems. Make sure to set it out of reach of children or animals just to be safe. But what we're going to do, we'll talk through a little bit, and we're going to go from front to back on this vehicle, talk through a couple of the things. So when you're doing a fluid flush like this, there's a couple reasons you might want to do that. The first is going to be if your fluid, if you visibly inspected it, which you should do on a regular basis, and it is discolored, has chunks in it, or is otherwise old. So in a situation like this, I recommend 3 to 5 years, you need to look at going ahead and changing it out. It's preventative maintenance. Your brake system is extremely important on your vehicle, so you want to make sure that it's taken care of. So it sounds a little early. I know, and it probably still looks like great fluid, but believe me, you can't see the water in that fluid. So you're not going to notice that lower boiling point until you put your foot on the brake pedal and you're building up a little bit of heat coming down a hill, and the pedal just goes to the floor and you don't have any brake pressure. Take care of it beforehand rather than dealing with the after effects. So what I'll have you do is come on, take a look over, and we will look at opening this master cylinder up and what's some of your do's and don'ts regarding that system. Let's see, it looks like one question popped up. So Charlie Peters actually asked about silicon fluid. And that is something, typically your .5 fluids are going to have silicon content to them. I believe you can also get the lower DOT numbers, so the 3 and the 4 with silicon content. It's really about personal choice. Do a little bit of research on what makes the most sense for your vehicle and your application. But normally I stick to just standard synthetic or just standard DOT3 fluid for most of my vehicles and applications. But what we're going to do is take a look here at the master cylinder, and what you want to do as just a little bit of an inspection, and also to make sure that you're filling the system properly. And so a standard, this one here is a 1971, so it does have a dual master cylinder or dual circuit master cylinder. And so you will have the front brakes and the rear brakes on 2 separate taps, essentially. And so older vehicles, typically pre-1965-ish, will often have just a single circuit master cylinder. So it will have just one inlet and outlet. It's a nice upgrade to something like this where it has separate front and rear brakes. Oftentimes people will talk about the benefit that if you lose one circuit, so if one of these lines were to be cut, you still have some of your brakes. You still have 50% of your brakes, but that's a little bit misleading, simply because if that line is cut, the piston inside the master cylinder does still have to go almost all the way to the bottom to give pressure to either side. So you will still have an extremely low pedal. It will still not be a fun situation, but you will still have some braking force. You will not have a full 50% though. When you're looking at opening your master cylinder to inspect it, you want to make sure you clean around the edges. Simply because if there's any dirt or grime that comes up off of here, the tires throwing anything into the engine compartment, if there's anything around the edge of this and we open it up and that goes into the master cylinder, that's going to then go into your brake system, and that's not something that you want. So these standard caps, you just take a standard screwdriver and lay it off to the side. It's nice and easy. And then I like to prepare a rag over here on the side and then pick straight up and tip it off to the side. And so from there I can look here on the top and see if there's any residue on the gasket, which looks pretty good. It's got just a little bit of rust from the top edge of this master cylinder. And then I can visually inspect the fluid inside. And so with this one, it might be a little bit dark for you guys to see, but it does have pretty fresh fluid in there. There's nothing floating around or anything in the fluid that necessarily needs to be worried about. This is a vehicle we drive on a pretty regular basis. It gets serviced annually, so it won't necessarily need a fluid flush like this, but that's what you're looking for anytime you're opening up a master cylinder. Is there anything in the fluid? Is it discolored from the kind of light amber that brake fluid will be? So on this one, we've got it filled to an appropriate level. It's not too high, it's not too low. You want to make sure if brake fluid is disappearing and you end up with a low level in your master cylinder, you need to find the leak. Simply topping off brake fluid on a regular basis because you're leaking brake fluid is not an acceptable solution. You want to make sure that you are filling the system and making sure that you don't have any brake pressure that is escaping and pushing fluid anywhere other than on the proper components. So what I will do is replace this cap and just lays down right on top, make sure it's seated and square, and then we'll pull the arm up over the top and make sure that's seated as well. So from there, we'll go ahead and take a walk back and look at the rear master cylinder, or the rear wheel cylinder, I'm sorry, and talk about a couple options here. So this is just a standard drum brake vehicle, and this is drum brakes on all four corners, and this would be the wheel that we want to start with when we're bleeding the system, and that is because it is the furthest from the master cylinder. There's a couple different schools of thought when it comes to how to bleed the systems, but the oldest and kind of the most well-respected is to start with the furthest from the master cylinder. So it would be the passenger side rear, and then you'll work your way closer. So passenger rear, driver's rear, passenger front, driver's front. Now, there is one thing when you're looking at newer vehicles or late model cars, you do want to take into account where the ABS controller is, especially on like Chevy pickups. Sometimes they can be rear mounted. And so you want to make sure you're actually taking a quick glance under the vehicle, because the brake lines might go back to go forward, and you actually have a longer line for a couple of the front lines than the rear. But take a look there. Your owner's manual will oftentimes say the order to bleed those in, or possibly a knowledgeable mechanic or your dealer can give you some insight on that. For bleeding brakes, there is a bleeder on the back side here, and I'll have you guys actually come and take a look from back here. Is probably going to be your easiest. See if we can take a look. And so on these brakes, it is this real simple dot on it. So you can see my wrench on it here, pointing at it, and that's the brake line coming in, and this would be the brake bleeder. Now I happen to have one here off of the car, an example for you that we can talk about and give you an example. Rather than pulling that one out and causing allowing air in the system, I went ahead and picked one up at the parts store to give you guys an example of what's going on here. So this is the part you can see, and it's just a simple nipple here on the outside that you can attach a hose to pull the fluid out and make sure that it doesn't spill on any of your components. Hex, and these will vary in size. A lot of import vehicles are going to be 10 millimeters, and even modern vehicles, anything built typically past the 80s, it's going to be a 10 millimeter or so, and then older vehicles might be a 7/16 or a 5/16 as well. And then threads into the wheel cylinder or the caliper, whichever. So whether you're drum brakes or disc brakes. And then you can see here there's a hole, and that connects to the outlet of that nipple. And then there's a conical seat down here at the bottom. And so that conical seat has a matching seat machined into the wheel cylinder or the caliper. And essentially what you're going to do is loosen that wheel cylinder, not much, sometimes as little as a quarter turn, depending on the thread count on the specific model you're working with. Turn that out just a little bit. That's going to unseat that conical seat and allow fluid to flow past it into that hole and out of the system. So essentially, there's a couple things that can happen with a bleeder that you'll want to be concerned with and make sure is working properly. And that is making sure that that hole is clear and that that seat is clean, because sometimes they can leak past the seat. It will come out the end of the bleeder. It may also come past the threads. If you have that problem, go ahead and replace these. These are some heavy duty application ones, and these are speed bleeders, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And these were still only $12 for a pair. So that's something, it's an easy repair. Take it out, put it in, bleed the system, and move on. But that gives you an idea of what the bleeder looks like now that we've seen it on the car. And so when you're loosening that, it's pulling that fluid out. There's a couple different ways that you're going to be able to actually pull the fluid out. There's a couple specialty tools for it, but before I talk about those specific tools, I'll give you one tip. This is one of my favorite tips. It's really hard sometimes if brake service hasn't been serviced in a while. Those brake bleeders can get stuck pretty easily. And what I recommend is actually getting a nice 6-point socket, deep well, and breaking them loose that first little bit of a turn with a ratchet and a nice 6-point socket. What that's going to do is prevent any of those flats from rounding off. Because if you round one of these off, it's really just a pain to deal with. So using a nice 6-point socket, it's going to get on there, get you the most contact, Sometimes you might need to add a little bit of penetrating fluid or penetrating oil. And if worse comes to worse, it sounds really counterintuitive, but give it just a little bit of tension to tighten it before you try and break it loose. And that will break up some of the crud that's in threads. Give it just a little bit, and then it'll come right back out on you. So just a tip there. Don't forget using your socket, because it'll be real tempting to just grab a wrench and put possibly a 12-point open-end wrench on there, and it'll round off, and it really turns a simple job into a long day. Breaking it loose with a socket is going to make it a little bit easier for you. So you break it loose with a socket, and you'll open it with a wrench. Now you have the system open. You need to get that fluid out. There's a couple different ways you can do it. One is to just open that and allow it to gravity bleed. And what that's going to do is you open that system up. I recommend putting a hose of some type on there to a container and controlling where that fluid is going and allowing it to just gravity bleed from the master cylinder to the wheel cylinder. It's going to take a long time, and if you possibly forget about it for a little bit, it'll drain the system dry, and then you're really back at square one. It's not the best way to go about doing things. The second way, some people might be familiar with one of these tools. I purchased one a while ago. It's quite handy. It's called a Mighty Vac. And what it does is, you can see it just pulls a simple vacuum there on the gauge. It's probably reading a couple pounds. And then you have a catch container on here. Whoop. So it will pull a vacuum, and then this little container here has a hose down to the bottom. So you put a little bit of fluid in there, and as it pulls fluid, it will trap any air in this container, and it won't allow any air to go back into the system, which is very nice. The problem is, I find these are a little bit cumbersome to deal with in the actual practice of using one. Sometimes it's great if you have an absolutely dry system or a fresh system where you've replaced multiple components, like a brake line, going from the front of the vehicle to the back. You can use something like this to really help get a lot of air out at once. But my preferred method, especially if you're just flushing a system that is working well right now, is the simplest method, and that is to use something like this. Some people call it a one-person bleeder or a single bleeder system, and it's just a container with a hose down to the bottom, yet again, so you'll have a little bit of fluid in there, and as it pushes out of the bleeder, it will go down that tube, and it will hold all of it in here. Any air will rise to the top, and it will prevent any air from being drawn back into the system. You can go out and you can buy a nice little kit like this. I probably spent $8 or $9 to get this small container, but what I really recommend is going out and buying some nice tubing and making one out of a water bottle, because typically this doesn't hold enough for me to do an entire rear brake line in one instance. So I end up having to empty this back out and go through the process again, and closing the bleeder, opening it back up, and it just ends up a little bit cumbersome. So it's nice for tight applications. Sometimes you can do this leaving the wheel on. We took the wheel off to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see. So something like this you can use wheel on, just kind of lay down underneath the vehicle, crack it open, and flush a lot of fluid out. But a larger container that you hang from a leaf spring or from the chassis at some point is going to make it a little bit easier for you. But we'll use this one for today. And so to use one of these properly, the way I recommend is I am going to go grab just a little bit of brake fluid to put in there for a second, where we put our .5 fluid. And I'm going to make sure to use the same fluid that is in the system. So I'll pour just a little bit in there, enough that the hose at the bottom cannot draw in any air. So that just makes sure that the bottom of that hose inside all the way down in fluid, so if it draws anything back, it's drawing fluid, not air. And then what I'll do, go ahead And look back here so we remember we're working with this bleeder here. And I will break it loose. So I'll put my 6-point socket on there and get it to just move a little bit to make sure it's loose, and I'm not going to strip it. I'll go ahead and put my bleeder on here. Make sure it fits. And it should be a pretty snug fit here. That's important so it doesn't draw air past the hose. So you can see that's really snug on there. And it'll stay tight. And then what we'll do is open that up just a little bit. And so it might not even flow if it's a nice tight system. And then what you can do is with this setup, I'll actually just go up and press on the brake pedal, one nice long press, and then release and press it again, and you guys will be able to see a little bit of fluid flow here. So I'll be back on camera here in just a moment. You'll be able to see. Let's see. I might have possibly not got it quite open enough. Doesn't look like it. So we'll open that up just a little bit more. And there it started flowing just a little bit of fluid. So make sure to keep our and you can see there that that's pushing fluid right up the line and into our container, and we don't have any air bubbles in here. And the nice part is this allows you to inspect the fluid as it's going through. So as you top off the master cylinder throughout the process, that's going to allow you to see when the fresh fluid begins to come out. We can see we've got good fresh fluid, no air bubbles, so I'll go ahead and tighten the bleeder down. And then I have a nice rag here to pull this off and make sure that I don't get any brake fluid where it doesn't need to be. Get that off completely. There we go. And there we can see the fluid that we extracted. So it's a little brownish, might be a little bit aged, but we know that's still good. It's not in poor condition. You'll empty that out into a separate container and bring that level back down to just low enough, and you can work your way around to each wheel cylinder. So it's a pretty simple process. There's a couple things to keep in mind as you're going through that process, of course, and that is you do always want to make sure each time you press the pedal and are going through and removing any of the fluid from the system, you want to make sure that your master cylinder is still topped off. So with that, you want to make sure each time you're doing a wheel cylinder, you're coming back and you're checking the master cylinder, topping off the fluid as appropriately, and then of course making sure that your bleeder does not overfill at the wheel, and that has proper fluid in it. Matt's taking a look to see if we have any questions. A couple final tips as you're going through a process like this. Sometimes on newer vehicles, it does make sense to take it to a shop. ABS computers can be very tricky when bleeding brakes. Sometimes you have to manually override those in order to do it properly. In a basic system, like most classic vehicles, pre-OBD2 especially, it's going to be the same process for just about any vehicle that you run across. Whether it's disc brakes or drum brakes, the process is the same. It's the same bleeder. They're just going to be located a little bit differently. The bleed screw is always going to be located typically on the top of whatever it is that you're bleeding. So on drum brakes, it's going to be on the top of the wheel cylinder on the backing plate. On disc brakes, it's going to be at the top of the caliper. And that is for a very simple reason. Essentially, air is always going to rise to the top of that fluid. And so you want to put where you're trying to draw air out of at the top of the system. So if you're filling up here, you're trying to push air all the way out to the back. It's going to be a little bit tough, but should be a pretty simple process, especially with just a simple one-person bleeder system. Is what I recommend. There is one other method that we didn't talk about, and it's not my personal favorite, but it is two methods, I guess I should say. There's two other methods that I don't have personal experience with. I've heard good things, but I don't necessarily have the means to try myself, and that is using an air compressor with a vacuum bleeder. So similar to the Mighty Vac that I looked at there, that pulls a vacuum on the system and pulls all of, not only the air, but all of the fluid out without having to press on the pedal or anything like that. Hooks up to an air compressor, it usually has fairly large capacity and can pull everything through. I've heard they work great, I've heard they don't work at all. It's really on a case-by-case basis. If it's something that you're interested in trying, I highly recommend doing it. I know it can make the system very easy, but oftentimes they're a little bit of an investment, and they're doing the same thing that you're doing this way and pushing it through. And again, that's only going to really help. That pulling a vacuum on the system is only going to significantly help if you have a lot of air in the lines, like a new line that you have. Another method is to push brake fluid from the caliper or from the wheel cylinder up to the master cylinder. And that is one that sometimes can work. I've used it on motorcycles before, but I don't typically recommend doing it on cars, simply because you are pushing fluid with force through to the master cylinder, and there's not an effective way to contain any overflow at the master cylinder. And so you're going to end up with brake fluid somewhere where it doesn't belong. I like the paint in your engine compartment, even though I may not have necessarily seen it, and I want it to stay there. So doing that, it is a very tempting thing to do. It's a very easy process. However, in most situations, it's just not going to be the most efficient way to do things compared to a single bleeder system. Of course, one last thing to consider, and I'm surprised I mentioned this when we were talking about the master cylinder. If you are filling the fluid here and you're trying to flush the system out, you could flush absolutely every bit of brake fluid that's currently in the master cylinder reservoir through the entire system. However, it's a lot more efficient to take something like that Mighty Vac and pull the fluid out of the cylinder or out of the master cylinder to make it a little bit quicker. You can take that down very low, fill it with fresh fluid, and then you're not flushing as much fluid through. If you don't want to purchase a Mighty Vac, they're typically around $30, $30 to $40. It's a handy little tool. It's helped me with some other things, but you know, it is a little bit of an investment. You can go rob your kitchen for your turkey baster. However, it will do great at that job, but don't put it back in your kitchen, of course. So maybe go out and buy a new turkey baster, have it be the garage turkey baster, label it as such. You'll find uses for it, I promise. It's a nice little tool. But pulling all of the fluid out of that master cylinder will help in the process. Like I said, it's a pretty easy process, but we do have a couple questions as we were talking through all of that. And so we'll go ahead and answer those. If one popped up in your mind as I was talking, go ahead and leave it in the comments right now, and we'll see if we can get through that one. Charlie Peters chimed in with, he has this 1961 Corvette. Very nice, I'm quite jealous. 59 is one of my favorite years, but the 61 is beautiful. With silicone brake fluid. Should I stay with silicone or go to .3? And honestly, I would recommend staying with whatever is in the vehicle currently, unless you have a reason to change. So you have silicone fluid in it right now. I would go ahead and stay there. There's no reason to flush the system out completely, possibly changing components to make sure that the seals and everything are going to remain with their integrity. If you have silicone in the system, go ahead and stay with that, especially if you know it. If it's a new vehicle or something like that where you're unsure of what is in there, sometimes there might be a way to test that fluid. I'm not aware of any currently. So I would always recommend just going ahead and flushing the system with your preferred product. But since you know what's in there right now, I'd recommend to go ahead and stay with that. Let's see if we have any other quick questions. All right, we've got one here. It looks like from Bob Kennard. So I have used the turkey baster method with draining the master cylinder. The basters go on sale right after Thanksgiving. You should buy 3 or more, dispose of them after use. That is a great tip. I had never thought about using Black Friday to buy some garage tools that were, maybe at just a standard home center. So Bob, thanks for that tip. I appreciate you sharing it. And of course, I appreciate everyone tuning in to this specific live stream for Hagerty Drivers Club. And if you want to share this one, or if you want to watch it after the fact, there will be a link. This will be viewable after the fact. And so I encourage you to share this one and talk about the Hagerty Drivers Club membership benefits with your friends. And make sure if you have any ideas for future live streams to let us know. That's tips@hagerty.com, tips@hagerty.com. And we can consider any ideas for future live streams. But for now, I do appreciate all of you guys tuning in. I'm Kyle Smith with Hagerty. That was How to Flush Your Brakes, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Hey, this is David with Hagerty. If you like content like this, cruise on over to our YouTube channel, click and subscribe. We have all kinds of stuff out there. We have our Redline rebuilds, we have Barn Find Hunters, we have Why I Drives, we even scatter in some DIY videos that's information you haven't seen yet.